In 1973, stars Robert Redford and Paul Newman gave the world a conniving and convoluted con film that comes down to the wire.
In 2021, we keep the Midwest theme rolling with a Kansas rye at barrel proof.
The film is The Sting.
The whiskey is Union Horse Rye Chicago Sting.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are looking at the 1973 Best Picture winner, The Sting. Brad, before we get into, the meat and potatoes of our episode today, maybe it's somebody's first time checking out our podcast. And, we don't usually give our little bump for ourselves up front. But, Brad, if you had to distill down, hey, see what I did there? If you had to distill down, they just turned it off.
Whiskey puns.
There it is. If it's their first time, they're done already. If you had to summarize what our podcast is about for a first-time listener, how would you explain it?
If I had to give you something to ferment on, I would say that we're just all about whiskey puns. No, we are two regular dudes who lived in Kentucky for a while, really love whiskey, and Bob is a guy who has just always loved movies. He's been a weird cinephile that couldn't really make any friends, and
Wow.
I took pity on him.
Wow.
And I have a little bit of movie history, but a lot of these movies I'm seeing for the first time. So Bob is trying to show me the ropes when it comes to movies, and I'm letting him know when he's wrong.
Yeah, that's pretty close to the truth, I'd say, except for the whole me not making any friends part. But whatever, we'll gloss over that, Brad. I would say that our podcast really does delve into the idea of discovery and kind of championing the new, right? Like you and I, when we first started this podcast, we knew next to nothing about whiskey other than that we really liked bourbon and we were kind of surrounded by it in Kentucky. And so we wanted to kind of dive in head first and talk about whiskey from a regular person's perspective. There are not a lot of podcasts out there that really specialize in bottles that you can pick up at almost any liquor store across the United States. And that's kind of what we're trying to do here. Brad is new to a lot of these movies. We're both new to a lot of these whiskeys, and we want to give reviews from the average person's perspective. And hopefully that's what we're doing. So if you are new to the podcast, welcome aboard. We're talking about one of my favorite 1970s films today. Brad, we are smack dab in the middle of a mini-series on the 1970s. How are you feeling about this decade so far, man? I know you've been kind of iffy up to this point.
Yeah, there's a lot of movies from the 60s and 70s where I just feel like I understand how it has the moniker of the revolutionary decade that kind of brought us into the modern era of cinema. I get it. But for me, a lot of times that has meant that they're just movies that aren't as good as modern films because they were the first versions of it and they're still working out the kinks. However, I would not say that about The Sting. There are certain elements that felt a little bit amateurish, but overall, man, this was just entertaining.
Yeah.
I wasn't stressed. I wasn't bothered. I definitely was kind of at the edge of my seat a little bit, but not in any way that caused me any sort of distress. It was just a fun movie through and through.
Absolutely. And that's the funny thing about this whole episode. We're in the middle of talking about, like you said, a very revolutionary decade. And then you have this movie in 1973 that is hearkening back to the Great Depression, and we're playing ragtime music and Scott Joplin. And it's what they like to call a movie. It's there to entertain. It's there to sit in a theater and share a bucket of popcorn with somebody and just be in awe of these two incredibly huge stars at the height of their powers doing what Hollywood stars do. It doesn't try to say anything deeper about society. It's just a fun movie, and it does it almost perfectly. And Brad, as we get into talking about this movie, we have a guest host with us today. We are bringing back one of our most favorite people in the world of whiskey, Chris Blatner, who goes by the moniker Urban Bourbonist on Instagram. Chris, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you guys so much for inviting me back. You know how much I love the podcast and the way that you guys go about analyzing these movies that you're watching from week to week. So again, thanks for inviting me back.
Oh man, it's our pleasure. When I first reached out to Chris, I said, like, here's the list of movies for season 4. What are you down for? And he immediately said The Sting. So I have a feeling that this movie might be kind of near and dear to your heart. Chris, what is it about this movie that you were so immediately attracted to?
Well, one, it takes place in my home city of Chicago, so it has that connection for me. Also, like when I saw that this was on the list, I knew that there was a really great whiskey that could be paired with this movie. So I kind of jumped at the chance to do this with you guys. And I'm also a big fan of Paul Newman and Robert Redford. So another bonus. I mean, two just absolutely amazing actors.
Yeah. I mean, watching this movie back, and we're going to get into talking about the movie here in just a moment, but I guess one of the first impressions that I had was that they really just don't have stars like this anymore in Hollywood. And Brad, this seems to be a recurring theme we talk about. You know, I think the biggest thing that we've really seen kind of come down the pike lately that would even remotely get close to this is when you pair up Leo and Brad Pitt in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But even that movie is not doing the kind of numbers that The Sting was doing. This is Robert Redford and Paul Newman. Like I said, at the height of their powers, they're coming off a collaboration they did in 1969, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which was an enormous success. This movie becomes an even greater success. And I guess one of the things that, if it makes me kind of sad, I guess, is that I don't know what two actors you could put in a movie like this nowadays and have it do big numbers. I just don't think movie stars are really a thing that we're making anymore.
Bob, I will say, after doing the podcast with you for 2 years, we both have certain like phrases that we use a lot. But hands down, my favorite one from you is when you describe an actor as being at the height of their powers. Because like in my mind, I just feel like you still think of actors as like having superpowers.
Someone actually had to explain to me that, you know, the Emperor in the Star Wars movies wasn't really shooting that stuff out of his fingers. I was truly blown away.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
I wonder if you guys think that in terms of like really star power actors and like a duo like this, do you guys think that at one point in time that could have been Matt Damon and Ben Affleck?
Oh, good question. Yeah, maybe. But again, like, I don't know if even in like the early 2000s, like if there was anyone that had the kind of cultural like cachet, like maybe if you had put Tom Hanks and Denzel together in this movie,
ooh, yeah,
it might have done it. I honestly think if you made it today and did Leo and Brad Pitt again, it would make tons of money. But I think it does say something about the state of, you know, movie stars today that both of those guys are in their 50s or their late 40s in Leo's case. There's really nobody younger that I can think of that would drive box office the way that you saw, you know, when Redford and Newman teamed up like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, if I can kind of pull back, and I don't know, this is a little bit bigger than our podcast normally goes. We just simply, like plain and simple, we have so much more content to consume nowadays. The actual level of public awareness and how much the public cares about actors is overall lower than it could have been back then. Because back then, like, you could only care about so much content because you only had the newspapers, the radio, a little bit of television, and movies.
Yeah.
And movie stars got all of the attention. Now, man, people don't care about movie stars as much. They want to follow their favorite TikTok star.
Well, and even with movie stars, like you said, like everything is so niche now that I don't think there's very many people that have broad appeal. No one seems to transcend like, okay, if you're a Marvel actor, you're a Marvel actor. And those are kind of like the biggest stars we have now. But then when they try to go outside of Marvel, they don't really find mainstream success very much.
They do things like Dr. Dolittle.
All right, Brad. So it is time for us to get into talking about the movie itself. And what that usually means is that we move into a segment called Brad Explains. This is where Brad breaks down the plot of the movie that he has just seen often for the first time. Brad, was this the first time you watched The Sting?
Oh, yeah.
All right. So we've got a first-timer here, folks. As you know, we have implemented a strict 60-second time limit on Brad Explains this season. Brad, do you think you can break down the plot of this movie in under 1 minute?
I think I might be able to. So The Sting is about a young grifter named Johnny Hooker, which is a very, very unfortunate name. And he is not a gigolo, contrary to what you might think. But yeah, he steals money. He works with an older gentleman named Luther. Luther gets out of the game, but the last con that they pull, they steal money from a big-time mobster named Doyle Lonigan. Now, Lonigan sends some men after him, and they kill Luther, and Hooker wants to get revenge on him. He goes to Luther's old friend Gondorf, and they set up a massive con on Lonigan to steal half a million dollars, $500 million. It is the 30s, so any amount of money was a lot.
It's like $10.
But yeah, it was like $10. So they set up the con. They involve the fake FBI. They pull in a local cop to kind of dupe him into doing their dirty work. It's a wild show, guys, and I was in the whole time.
Yeah, me too, man. All right, so we have a movie to talk about here, guys, and I think the place to start is with Newman and Redford. Like I said, they're coming off of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which was a massive success, and they decide to re-team with the same director, George Roy Hill. So the whole gang gets back together for this movie. I don't know if you guys have ever seen, Butch and Sundance, but I'm not a huge fan of that movie. And I think The Sting, for me at least, just works better on almost every level. And it starts at the top with Newman and Redford. So, Brad, which one of those two do you think we should talk about first?
I mean, I think you can start with who the ultimate main character of the movie is, Johnny Hooker. Mm-hmm. You have Robert Redford in this film, and I think what makes him so interesting and compelling in this movie is how deeply he actually cares for Luther at the start of the film. Like, you can tell he's an idiot. He blows a lot of his money. He's not the best grifter out there, but he deeply cares for Luther, and that's like a humanizing element. The way he interacts with Luther's family and talks to them about going to church. And there's just something about him that is so eminently likable in this film that you just can't help but fall in love with his character.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Brad. You're drawn in by him and his character. And even though he does seem to be kind of like this guy who definitely doesn't have it together at all, there's just something that kind of has you like cheering for him, right off the bat.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And Redford is really leading into that sort of Robert Redford charm. Like, he's such a good looking man. I mean, same thing with Paul Newman, but both of these guys are leaning on their movie star looks, but they're playing them, to get sympathy on their side too. And that's what I really, really love about Redford's performance here. And Brad, you just watched it for the first time. I think one of the things I was surprised about watching it this time through was how early on in the movie they really set up the stakes and how in deep Redford is. Like, they kill his best friend, I'd say 12 minutes into the movie. It's really, really early. And I think you have that sort of specter of that hanging over you throughout the movie. So even when you're kind of getting caught up in how fun the setup of the big con is going to be, that somebody already died, and there is this kind of element of danger that continues to hang over it.
Well, and can we just say for a second that I was sitting there thinking to myself, oh my gosh, like Luther sounds like James Earl Jones, and he looks like him too. And who's the actor's name? Oh, it's Robert Earl Jones.
That can't be a coincidence, right?
That can't be a coincidence. Dude, I was like blown away because at the very start when they're running the grift on the guy, like he kind of like makes his voice a little more higher pitched and he's worried. But as soon as he sits down at the table and starts using his actual normal voice, I was like, oh my gosh, it's Mufasa, it's Darth Vader.
Yeah, so Luther is played by Robert Earl Jones, who is James Earl Jones's father. And like, once you know it, you can't unsee it because they look exactly alike. They sound incredibly similar. It was really cool to kind of have that family connection here.
I thought that was one of the more interesting things in terms of like the characters and finding that out like as you're either watching the movie or after the movie. But it is one of those things that's just like striking when, like Brad said, like when you hear his voice, when you hear him actually speak, and then you make the connection. It's pretty cool. It's just like one of those kind of hidden elements of the movie that makes it fun.
And I will say, one of my gripes with this movie is that a lot of the secondary characters, and Bob, we've talked about this before with, movies from the 60s and 70s, a lot of the secondary characters and the tertiary actors in the film aren't always that great. But Luther, as, somebody who has 10 to 15 minutes of screen time in a 2-hour film, like, he is spectacular. Mm-hmm. I was just captivated by him at the start of this film.
Yeah, and they really, again, like they really try to get you on their side too. He's such a likable guy that when you see how they kill him, it's heartbreaking. And it really is a testament to how well scripted this movie is and how well directed it is, that within 15 minutes, you can watch this guy steal somebody's money. And then when he gets punished for it, you feel badly for him. All right, so on the other side of the equation, we've got Paul Newman. Now, apparently Newman was kind of coming off of a string of movies that were not huge successes, and so this movie was kind of a return to the norm for him. It kind of relaunched his career. I was really shocked watching it through again at how little he's in the movie, to be quite honest. Like, they're billed as co-stars of the movie, and Brad, you already said this, but it really is Redford's movie, and Newman is a supporting character. But even as a supporting character, I was kind of shocked at how little he's in the movie.
Yeah, I mean, he really just kind of like casually falls into certain scenes and then just kind of seamlessly transitions out and allows, he allows the director to focus on Robert Redford as the star of this film. But it really is Newman who, in my opinion, is like the glue that holds this movie together. That he gives such a rock solid, kind of firm, foundational, steadying performance that keeps this movie from like falling off the rails a little bit.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I feel like if this was just Redford, like I obviously he's the main character and he carries most of the movie. If say this movie was made with just him as like the sole star of the movie, I'm not sure that it would have worked as well as it did. I mean, obviously Paul Newman's a great actor and he adds so much, but I like that analogy of him being the glue. He kind of just holds everything together and it really makes everything work.
So before we move on from the actors, I really do want to talk about Robert Shaw for a minute, who plays Lonigan. I love Robert Shaw. This is 2 years before he does Jaws and really kind of cements his legacy. Brad, we haven't talked about Jaws on this show yet, but watching those two movies, I'd say within the last 6 months, I saw Jaws, and I was really struck by how different the two characters that he plays are. Quint in Jaws is just an old, surly drunk. And in this movie, Lonigan is really on top of what's going on. He's pretty much sober, and he gets played for a fool, but you can tell that he's a really calculating, kind of conniving guy. I really loved his performance in this movie. And before we, dive into some of his physical mannerisms, apparently the limp that he has in this movie was real because he had a really bad fall and an accident on a wet handball court like a week before they started filming. And so they just kind of kept the limp throughout filming to keep things consistent. So that's why he limps in this movie.
Little things like that. I don't know why that kind of trivia just makes me so happy. Like, they're like, yeah, we love Shaw. We're going to have him for this movie. And he's going to have a limp now. That's just going to be a thing that he does.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think his performance is fantastic. And what I think is great, too, is that he's obviously this really smart guy for, the position that he has in this movie, being like a mob boss. They portrayed him in a way like he's obviously being duped throughout this whole movie, but you're also sitting there going, there's no way he could possibly figure this out. Like, as you're watching the movie, yes, he's being duped, but he's not a dumb guy. He's really being conned by some really good con men.
Yeah.
He was such a huge bright spot of this movie.
Well, and in some ways, I kind of feel like, Brad said that Paul Newman was the glue. I almost kind of feel that way about Robert Shaw in this movie, because movies like this have to have a good and compelling villain. You have to know what they're capable of, and you have to know that they are, potentially smarter than the hero, and the hero has to find a way to outsmart this really smart person.
I'm putting $500,000 on Lucky Dan to win third race at Riverside.
Can't lay that off in time. Bet like that could break us.
Not only are you a cheat, you're a gutless cheat as well.
What are the odds? 4-1. Take all of it.
And I think the script really sets that up to succeed in this movie, that at any point, if Robert Shaw finds out what's going on, everybody's dead, and you know that. And so the stakes are kind of constantly there, and you enjoy watching him get played. But if they played him as just like a big, dumb, brutish guy, like that would not be an enjoyable movie. It would just seem like they too easily, beat him or outsmarted him. And watching them have to set up this insanely convoluted and complicated con, I think that's where the enjoyment comes from. So like in some ways, I really think having a good villain in this movie is what makes it such a good movie.
Well, and the reason I think the key defining aspect of Lonergan as a character is how seriously he takes everything. Mm-hmm. And the thing that really sets that up is when when he's out golfing, he's out on the green just chipping, and his number two comes up to him and is talking to him about something. And he points out this other guy, and he's like, I've known him since I was 6. And if he found out that I was weak and had lost this money, I'd have to kill him. And like, you get the sense that his character takes everything seriously and is so hyper aware of any threat to his dominance that in order to dupe a man like that, you have to be just as serious as he is about what you're doing.
Yeah.
And so the way that he is written and the way that he is portrayed by Shaw, it just makes everything work.
No, I totally agree. And I guess if we can pivot before we go to our break, I do want to talk about the script of this movie, because it is an almost perfect example of how to write this kind of movie. And the reason I say that is about, I'd say 3/4 of the way through the movie, I realized that until that point, they explained everything they were going to do to the audience. And so they set you up as an audience to think that you know exactly how everything's going to go down, right? Like you've watched them pull off 2 or 3 kind of smaller cons to set up the big con. And along the way, they've told you exactly what they're going to do. And so as an audience member, you feel very smart. You feel like, yep, I'm watching this guy get outsmarted, and how dumb is he? And then at the end of the movie, what they do is they kind of pull the rug out from under you as an audience member, because there are things that they did not set up earlier in the movie. And you basically find out that, like, Redford and Newman have been plotting kind of off screen to take care of some of these other elements. And I think it's really, really smart, because if you had held the audience's hand the whole way through, then there's no payoff for us. Like, we just watched them do what they said they were going to do. And I think that having that little bit of, mystery and how are they going to get out of this one, and we don't know, that's where the suspense of that final con comes from.
Absolutely. And I think that's why this movie is so well regarded by so many people, is exactly that. Like that little bit of information that is not given to the audience or to the viewer really just puts this movie kind of over the top, I think.
Well, and not only does it put it over the top, but it really sets the tone for any sort of mystery heist movie to come. Like, honestly, I'm thinking about Knives Out right now.
Yep.
That, like, Knives Out would not exist if not for movies like The Sting.
Like, Knives Out kind of does the same thing in that it gives its own ending away, like in the first act, or it solves the mystery in the first act. And so as an audience, you're kind of thrown off kilter, because you're like, wait a minute, I thought this was going to be a whodunit. And it really doesn't turn out to be as much of a whodunit as you're watching kind of like the fallout of a killer trying to cover their own tracks because they've already been found out. And I love when you have movies like this because they know exactly how much information to give to the audience and how much of it to withhold. And I think that, Brad, you and I have been talking before we started recording today. There's definitely a movie that we're going to talk about in the second half that is in a huge debt to The Sting. And I'm sure most of our audience can kind of figure out exactly what that movie is. But before we get there, I think it's time for us to hit pause and to drink this Union Horse Rye. What do you guys say?
Let's do it.
Let's get to it.
All right, today we are checking out Union Horse Rye Chicago Sting. Now, this is a single barrel pick that Chris sent to us, and I'm really interested to hear more about it. This is the first time we've had Union Horse as a company on our show, but I've seen them all over the place, especially on Whiskey Instagram. They are always a fixture there. I've heard great things about Union Horse. This particular barrel that we're drinking today clocks in at 63.47% alcohol by volume or 126.94 proof. Brad, we are drinking a hot whiskey today.
Yeah, we are. And I will say, Chris is obviously one of our favorite friends of show. Like, the dude is amazing, but I'm just going to point something out, that this is like a single barrel whiskey that he sent us, and that alone is amazing. But in these little 3 to 4 ounce sample bottles, a lot of times people send it to us and it'll be 3/4 full, and it's more than enough for us to drink. And obviously we're thankful for any amount of whiskey we get. Chris here, he filled this bottle literally as full as he could get it. And I understand that's probably only an extra 1/4 ounce of whiskey. But when you're talking about whiskey as rare as what we're getting here, I'm in all seriousness, Bob. This speaks to the kind of guy Chris is.
Totally agree, man. Listen, if we could just do a whole bonus episode talking about how much Chris Blatner has meant to us through our podcasting journey, I would do it. And so, Chris, let me just put you on the spot a little bit here, man. First of all, thank you for the whiskey. Thank you for being such a good guest host. But I want to turn this over to you, man. The floor is yours. Tell us about this barrel, where it came from, what you love about it.
Well, again, thank you guys for that. I'm blushing over here, but I like to share the whiskey. So, I'm going to try and use up all that space in those sample bottles. But this particular barrel, one, right off the bat, I thought this would be perfect for the movie. It's called Chicago Sting. So it's just the perfect one for the Sting. But this is Union Horse Distilling. It's kind of a distillery that's near and dear to my heart because I've just gotten to know them so well, and I've gotten to know their local rep here in Chicago so well, Wilson Torres, at 312 Made on the Instagram. Really great guy. He's actually the first person that, when I started my Instagram page back a couple years ago, that took me through a tasting and wanted to meet with me in person. And, I was an Instagram page with, at that time, 100 followers or less. And this guy took an entire evening to taste me through their lineup of whiskeys. So just a distillery that's really near and dear to me. But this particular barrel, Chicago Sting, eventually this came to market through Wilson picking it for the Chicago market. And he's kind of, I think, pioneered this, at least in Chicago. And I really don't know of any other distilleries doing this, but he picked the barrel from the samples, that he received from the distillery and said, what, this is so good. And I'd love to present this to the Chicago market exclusively. So he picked the barrel and then went to independent stores here in Chicago that may not have otherwise been able to do a single barrel because of the cost, and said, hey, do you want, half of a case? Do you want a case? You can put this on the shelf. You can say you have a single barrel of Union Horse. And it kind of brings some notoriety to the store, being able to say they can offer a single barrel. And Wilson's done a great job of doing this. I believe this was the first rye he ever brought to the Chicago market. So it's almost 6 years old. It's 5 years, 10 months, I think. Bob, you mentioned it's a hot one. It's 127 proof basically. But I feel like that heat is pretty nicely integrated into this. And I just think this is just an immaculate barrel of rye whiskey.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest with you. This is my second pour of it now. Like Brad said, when Chris fills a bottle, you get multiple pours. And my first pour of it, I don't know if it just needed some time to kind of open up from the bottle or what, but I couldn't tell how old this was because it kind of smelled like a young rye. It was really grain forward. And I texted Chris and I said, hey, like, is this a really young rye or is it just like a really high rye mash bill? And he wrote back and said, no, this is like over 5 years old, but it's 100% rye. And I was like, that's what it is. Yes. Okay. So once you understand that this is a 100% rye, I think it really kind of clicks into place what's going on the nose here. Brad, what are you picking up on the nose?
I was going to say the first note that I have for the nose is that it's surprisingly soft. Like, and not in a bad way. Like, whenever you get something 120 proof or above, you just kind of prepare yourself for a pretty alcohol heavy nose, and it's not there. I mean, it is a beautiful nose. For me, I was getting a little bit of cinnamon, brown sugar, felt like there's a little bit of like an orange peel, some baking spices. This is a complex and interesting nose that has me just so excited to dive into the taste. I'll give it an 8.5 out of 10 on the aroma.
Yeah, I think I'm actually going to come out to an 8 out of 10 here, Brad. And because this is my second pour, like I knew what to expect. And this time around, like you said, it really did seem a little bit softer. I think, again, it may have just needed some time to kind of open up and settle down a bit. It is a bit oak forward, and you'll get that with being in the barrel for almost 6 years. It has a really great Coca-Cola note on the nose. There's a lot of caramel on this, which I was not expecting, like, at all. And then for me, like, it has those kind of classic rye notes. You get a lot of black pepper on the nose. Once this sat in my glass for about 5-10 minutes, the dominant note that took over for me was clove. And that's something that I don't always get on a rye. I really, really liked it. I liked this nose a lot. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10.
Very nice. So this nose is, and I agree, the alcohol does not come through on the nose. Like, nosing this, I would never think this is almost 130 proof. When you read that number, you think that this is going to like singe your nose as you start smelling it, but it really does not do that. I get a lot of, like, Bob, you had mentioned like you smelled the grain, and I get like this really floral kind of quality out of this, which I think is indicative of a 100% rye. Rye can sometimes give off those floral or herbal kind of aromas on the nose, and this being 100%, I get a lot of that kind of sweet floral note on the nose. But I get this really interesting note, and I talk about this a lot with my tasting notes and nosing notes. I kind of relate things back to candy that I had like as a kid. And I get this really interesting note on the nose of this that's like those Bitto honey candies, kind of like a mix nutty caramel and honey all together. Just a really, it is really a nice, complex, evolving nose. I'd give this a 9 out of 10.
All right, so we're all between an 8 and a 9 on the nose. Talking about the taste here, it's very spicy, as rye tends to be. It's got rye for days, like which is to be expected. It's not overly sweet, but just enough to kind of, combat the tendency that rye sometimes has to go bitter or sour on the back of the palate. It stays sweet enough. It is very hot on the tongue, like definitely a really nice tingle on the tongue. For me, Brad, I don't know if you're picking this up, but on the back of the palate, I got a lot of dark chocolate and I got black tea as well, which kind of reminded me of that one we drank from the Few Company, the Immortal Rye, which has black tea in it. Like, I don't know if I'd go so far as to call this tannic or say that it was like really oaky, but it really did remind me of kind of a bitter black tea on the back of the palate.
Yeah, honestly, for me, as I got into the taste profile, I felt like there's a little bit of sweetness there. You got a little bit of vanilla that kind of honed its way into some citric type feelings. It like I said, that orange peel flavor kind of stuck with me. And then it just, as it moves towards the finish, like you said, Bob, it gets spicy and it feels like I just shoved an entire slice of rye bread in my mouth. And it's spectacular. I mean, the taste on this is really, really just well done. I think the most important thing is that it's not overpowering. Like a lot of times rye, especially with things like this that are like 100% rye, man, it can just become an overpowering, that kind of sour, spicy rye note. And this one just keeps me going. I'm going to stick where I was at the start. I'm going to give it an 8.5 on the taste.
Yeah, and I think a lot of, actually, I agree with everything that both of you guys have said about this. It really has a lot happening. It has a lot going on. The palate for me, I get a little bit of a sweeter note out of this. Bob, you touched on one of the notes that kind of lends itself to why this is named Chicago Sting. You said, I think you actually said it kind of stings your tongue a little bit, like with a peppery kind of. I also get this really nice, sweet, like rich honey on the palate. Totally get that peppery sting. I get that clove like on the finish on this, and you certainly get like a dry, sort of oaky, bitter spiciness on the finish of this. So that kind of punch and sting on the tongue that you get, and a little bit of those sweeter honey notes, and that's kind of where I think you went in naming this.
I love it. Yeah, I'm gonna give it a 7.5 on the taste. Like, if there was one thing that I might be able to kind of tweak a little bit, it is that it's a little over oaked for me on the back end of the palate, and that kind of leads me into my finish here. Oak and herbs. Like you talked about the herbal notes on the nose. I think the herbal notes really come out on the finish here. You get a little bit of that kind of rye grain on the finish. But for me, like the dominant herbal note is kind of like a minty, which you do get with rye sometimes. It doesn't tip into like the kind of sour dill flavor. This is definitely more of a minty flavor for me. And Brad, this might just be a character flaw with me. You know that I don't like it when finishes are kind of overly oaky for me. And I think that might be just the one little ding that I would have on this whiskey. So for me, the finish is going to be a 7 out of 10.
Oh man, I feel like the finish is really where this whiskey shines. For me, it finishes with so much spice, so much rye. I feel like I'm getting a lot of those baking spices. And the most important thing for me with a rye, and usually this only happens with younger ryes. I haven't noticed it on as many like 5-6 year ryes, but it doesn't turn sour. I feel like a lot of young ryes just sour on your palate at the very end after you finish. And this one does not do that. It leaves you with a really nice mouthfeel, a really nice finisher. And I really enjoy that a lot. I think I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10 on the finish. I love the Kentucky hug. I love the loaf of rye bread that you're eating, and I love the fact that it doesn't sour on my palate.
Yeah, I mean, you guys, I think are pretty much nailing this whiskey, and actually coming up with some things now that I've been tasting it that I really hadn't thought about, and like I'll go to something that you said about the finish, Bob, is that I'm noticing kind of a little bit more oak on the palate on this, and a little bit of, I think you had mentioned like tannic a little bit, maybe too, on the finish. And I'm sort of noticing that now too. And I like it. I love this all the way through from the palate, nose, palate, finish. But those things like on the finish for me, like there is a little bit of a bitterness to this that not off-putting, but it's just not exactly what I always look for in a whiskey. So for me, I'm going to give this an 8.5 on the palate, and the finish is going to be an 8 for me.
All right, that takes us to overall balance. This is where we talk about nose, taste, and finish, all taken kind of as a collective whole. Was this a really cohesive drinking experience for you, or did something kind of stand out in a positive or negative way? I do think this was a really consistent drinking experience. What was on the nose was there on the taste and on the finish. You know, for me, it was a little bit over oaked, kind of at the back of the palate and into the finish, but I don't really think that takes away from the experience as a whole. Brad, I'm going to give this I was going to say 8, but I think I'm going to bump it up to an 8.5 on balance.
Yeah, you are, because I'm giving it an 8.5 as well.
There you go.
I think this is an incredibly well-balanced whiskey. It's got a few hiccups here or there, like you said, Bob, but overall, it's a smooth drinking experience, especially when you consider the proof point that you're drinking at.
Overall on this, I think I have to be right there with you at 8.5. I mean, this is just all around. It's just a great drinking rye whiskey.
All right, now we are going to fly through the value portion of this because I have very important questions to ask both of you after we give final scores. But Chris, you told us that the price on this was about $67 for a fifth. Now, again, we're taking in mind this is a craft distiller. Like this, you know, it's not one of the big boys. It is a barrel-proof rye. It's a single barrel selection that was only available in a very small number of stores. Like, we're very privileged to be drinking this. And we also know that as rye gets more aged, it definitely goes up in price. Like Old Overholt released an 11-year this last year. It was $75, and that was made by Jim Beam. So $65 is not an astronomical amount to be asking for this. But Brad, for me, I do still struggle just a little bit with that price point. I wish that this was like in the, $57 range as opposed to $67. So for me, I think I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10 on value.
I think you're crazy, bro. This is, as you said, it's a craft distillery that is a limited rare release whiskey that is 127 proof. Holy cow. Like, for me, it's a B to a B plus in every single category across the board. I can't help but give it an 8.5 out of 10 on the value.
All right.
Like, I know, like, anytime we get over $50, we're really starting to hit the pocketbook pretty hard. But if I had a chance to buy this, I would be in.
Yeah, and this it's tough. I get it when it gets over $50. That there's so much out there that can be purchased, but 100% rye is not cheap. It's not easy to work with.
That's a fair point.
Yep. Putting this out, they waited almost 6 years to put this out. That's a lot of time to be sitting on this barrel. $67. This beats so much that is even priced higher than that from so many different places. I have to give this a 9.5 for value.
Wow.
And the 100% rye whiskey factor, which is not easy to work with. I find this to be an incredible value at under $70.
All right, fine. I'm the jerk. I get it. Brad, I'm coming out to a 38 out of 50. What are you coming out to?
Bob, I'm a little bit higher than you. I'm coming to a 43 out of 50.
And Chris, where are you coming out to?
I'm coming out to a 43.5.
All right.
Ooh, Chris.
Wow.
I mean, honestly, Bob, like this doesn't surprise me. Like, I've always been a little bit higher on ryes than you have. And so like a 38 out of 50 for you with a rye is honestly a pretty impressive score.
Well, thank you very much, my good man. I appreciate that. No, but like if you take our average together, we're coming out to a 40.5 out of 50 or an 81 out of 100. It's pretty rare to get us over a 40 on average. I think we'd both recommend picking this up. Brad, I think without hesitation, right?
Oh yeah, dude, this is spectacular. Like if you can get your hands on it, start a podcast and become friends with Urban Bourbonist. But yeah, if you can get your hands on some, buddy, you're in for a treat.
All right, so here's the question I wanted to ask you guys, because last time Chris was on the show, we also drank a high proof rye, and that was the Old Overholt 114, which was released only in Ohio and Pennsylvania. Chris was huge on that one. Again, I think I kind of like brought up, the rear on that one. I was just a little bit cooler on it than both of you guys were. I'm interested to hear which one of these two you would pick. And I want you to consider not just which one's better, because this one's better. Like, it's more complex. It has much more going on. But again, the Old Overholt 114 was $30.99, I think. I think it was $31. So we're talking over double the price for this one. And, if you're a rye drinker who's just kind of getting into rye, I think that Old Overholt is a really great entry point, at barrel proof. I think that this one is definitely more special occasion. You want to savor it a little bit. So help me kind of parse this out. If you had to pick one, which would you pick and why?
I think for me, I guess I'll say this. If the Chicago Sting was a mass-produced, like this was just Union Horse's barrel-proof rye, this is just what they made every year, I think I might say the Old Overholt just because of the price difference. To say, hey, if you want to get into the world of barrel-proof rye, go for that. It's $30. You're not going to, it's barely going to make a dent in your wallet. Go for it. But if you had a choice, if you had the two in front of you and you paid $67 for this or $30 for that, I would just have to say, because of the rarity, the Chicago Sting takes the bill for me.
Yeah, this is a tough comparison. I mean, that Old Overholt is one of my favorite distilleries also, Jim Beam, and these are so different. I'd have to choose the Union Horse. I mean, it is, I think, an incredible value for what is in this bottle. That's not taking anything away from that Old Overholt. It just, I would have to take this Union Horse. It's just that good.
I think I would too. And I think that's maybe the best kind of recommendation we can give, is that we all
don't sound so regretful.
Womp womp. I guess I would too. No, seriously, a hearty and full-throated response from all of us in terms of go out and find some Union Horse. First of all, it may not be this specific barrel, but I think we can all attest, based on what we've drank today, that it's worthwhile to pick up something that they are producing right now. I hope to get more of their product on the show in the future. Chris, we can't say thank you enough for these samples. But guys, we have a movie to get back into talking about. So what do you say we return to The Sting?
Let's get to it.
All right, so that was Union Horse Rye, Chicago Sting. We're getting back into talking about the Sting. And Brad, we are resurrecting a segment we haven't done in forever. We're going to read some hot takes.
Hot takes.
Hot takes.
Hot takes.
Chris, give us your best hot takes.
Hot takes.
There it is.
There it is.
Hot takes is when we look at 1-star reviews of the movie that we're currently in conversation about. And today's review comes from IMDb user PotterFan9791. And the review is titled, "Not Good at All, period." This movie is so bad. I really don't like the story or acting. It's overrated in my humble opinion and makes people fall asleep. Watch The Social Network instead. This movie just makes no sense because it talks about things that are boring and not fun. I wouldn't recommend watching it at all. Sometimes I want to fall asleep so bad that I have nightmares I am still awake.
Jeez.
The only interesting part was the naked woman at the beginning. If there was more of that, this could deserve a 2-star review, but even that can't make me love it. It's one of those movies you have to be crazy to enjoy. The part where they steal the money is predictable and dumb. I've seen Barney produce better feature films. Have you ever seen The Count of Monte Cristo? This is worse. Can you imagine? Stay away. Stay far, far away. 1 star.
Because of all the naked women in Potter in the world of Harry Potter.
Listen,
kept
that
person
review
interested.
was a true roller coaster. Like I laughed, I cried. It talked about The Social Network for no reason. It talked about The Count of Monte Cristo. I assume he gave just way too much information about his personal life and his struggles to fall asleep. I really hope that his insomnia is cured by now. Like, what a review.
I mean, that had to be by some teenager that just was, bored and looking to troll something. Some really crazy references in there.
I mean, I just can't understand, like, you don't like The Sting? Well, maybe you should try The Social Network instead. Like, those aren't even related films. Like,
that makes no sense.
See, now I will say this review sparked in me. I want to see Aaron Sorkin rewrite The Sting.
Oh, God.
Everybody's just walking like 30 miles a minute.
Just a walk and talk. Oh, man. No, but Brad, we talked before we went to break about how this movie is kind of the prototype for heist movies that we would see in the future. And I think like the obvious analog here is the 2001 remake of Ocean's 11. And, honestly, Ocean's 11 was, like I said, it's a remake, but it has much more in common with this movie than I think it does even the original Ocean's 11. And we were kind of talking about how star power doesn't really seem to drive movies anymore. Ocean's 11 kind of exists in a world where we were just coming out of the 1990s. George Clooney is on fire. Brad Pitt, like Matt Damon, Chris, you talked about Matt Damon in the first half. I want to say that Ocean's 11 is the closest thing that, our generation has to what people experienced when they watched The Sting. Am I right in thinking that?
That's exactly what I was thinking pretty much the entire time I was watching this movie, is that like Ocean's 11 owes everything to this movie. They owe everything to this movie.
Yeah, I mean, as I was watching this, I literally couldn't stop thinking about the fact that Brad Pitt looks and acts almost exactly like Robert Redford.
The older he gets, the more he looks like Robert Redford too.
He just does, man. Like, they look so much alike. And I will say, this is just a random thought, and I'm going to throw it out there. I feel like Ocean's 11 and The Sting are like capitalist versions of The Great Escape.
You know what? This
It's
does
like-
it's crazy you mentioned that, Brad, because this movie has that sort of, I guess if I had to use a word for it, like very kind of buoyant, bouncy kind of quality to it, where you're like, you're watching people escape from a horrible like prisoner of war camp, but it's light and it's enjoyable and it's entertaining. And I think that both of these movies have that kind of, I guess buoyancy would be the word I would use.
Yeah, like I know that this is a term for a different type of movie, but it almost feels like a buddy film where like it's just like a bunch of friends, pals, pulling a con on some people, whether it's, the Nazis of World War II or the mobsters of the 1930s. Like, it's just these guys who are like, they're just hanging out and doing some crazy stuff. And there's some, there's pretty high stakes involved. But like you said, Bob, there's a lightheartedness to it that helps you deal with how high the stakes are.
Well, before we sign off for the day, Brad, I'm going to introduce a one-time segment that's probably never going to come back again. But the segment is called Give the Boomers Some Credit. Because, our generation just absolutely loves to crap on baby boomers. And yet, I do think that when you look at the box office receipts of movies in the 1970s, like things that became successful were much more varied in terms of what they portrayed and the content that they had. We talked about it with The Godfather, that a 3-hour-long mafia movie, about a very sort of niche culture became the highest grossing movie ever. And this movie comes out the year after The Godfather, and it makes, in today's dollars, the equivalent of $800 million at the box office. It is, as of 2018, according to the internet, it was still the 20th highest grossing movie ever when you adjust for inflation. Like, this doesn't seem like the kind of movie, by today's standards, that would bring in that kind of money. Like, it has to be an Avengers movie nowadays. And I really, really respect that just based on Newman and Redford and a good script and an enjoyable time, that a movie like this could come out in 1973 and make the equivalent of $800 million. So, I mean, I guess the question that I have for you guys is like, could this even conceivably happen today? And do we need to give the boomers their credit for making it happen in 1973?
Well, 100%, man. I think that, and there's so much ink spilled on this topic, so I'm not going to go deep into it. But like nowadays, it's just all about intellectual property. Like, you have to rely on things that had already been written, that were already popular with a niche group of people. You know, in the case of the MCU, it's comic books, and use that with, you know, pretty high quality filmmaking to make money. But back in the day, you could just have really good stars, a really good script. It's a one-off movie. There's no sequel. There's no universe built around this thing.
There is a sequel. There is a sequel.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's apparently terrible, and it didn't happen for like 10 years after this movie came out, and neither of the stars are in it. But
I'm not surprised that it was bad.
But your point is taken.
Yeah, but like in the end, it's just a good movie to be a good movie. There's no other reason for it to exist. And I like that about it. And so, yeah, it's not surprising to me that the boomers loved this movie back in the 70s.
I think this came out just at the right time. It was done extremely well. It all came together with the cast, with the script, with the directing. And you have to give credit, though, to them for creating this movie for the time and it being a gigantic success.
I mean, this movie was nominated for 10 Oscars. It won 7, including Best Picture, which I think also says something about the Academy Awards, that they were willing back then to reward a movie like this. You know, like this movie came out the same year as The Exorcist, which was the highest grossing movie of that year. And to see, you know, when you go through the Best Picture nominees, like, you know, there's an Ingmar Bergman movie, so the Academy was considering foreign films back then, but you also have American Graffiti, you've got The Exorcist, you've got The Sting. It just seemed like, you know, in general, the general public and the Academy were both more open to many types of film back then than they are today. And I think that, you know, I don't think I'm alone in wishing that a movie like this could come out today and be recognized by both, you know, popular audiences and by the people who give out the awards at the end of the year.
Yeah, Bob, I think in the end, then, what's most important is what we think about this movie. Because, you know, everybody else has their own thoughts. But here at the Film and Whiskey Podcast, we recognize that we are the foremost authorities on movies. So, Chris, as a special co-host guest member of the Film and Whiskey Podcast, what would you give The Sting out of 10?
Out of 10, I really liked this. It's highly entertaining. It's really well done. It kind of keeps you on the edge of your seat. There is that factor at the end where if you haven't seen this before, you're kind of surprised at the ending. Overall, great performances, really well done movie. This is an 8 out of 10 for me.
Brad, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I'm in a similar spot. I think that there's a few issues with the cinematography. I'm not always a big fan of the camera movement in this movie. Some of the lines are a little bit stilted. Even the very start of the movie, like when Robert Earl Jones and Robert Redford like pulled off their grift and they were like, "Hey, we'll meet soon back at my place." Like the way that they acted that, it just felt like way overacted. And you saw a few issues like that, which to me would point towards the director. But overall, it is an entertaining, fun romp of a film that I'll give an 8.5 out of 10 to.
Brad, I think once again, this is one of those movies that it becomes really hard to quantify because it's not aiming for anything deeper or bigger than itself. It's just an entertaining movie. And I think even when you look at, you know, the modern remake of Ocean's 11 compared to this, I just watched Ocean's 11 last year sometime, and I really liked it. And I think it's a really great movie, but I do think it suffers a little bit from the fact that it has to juggle, 11 plus characters throughout the movie. And this one, it's two guys, and it's really just the one guy that it's focusing on. There's a similar kind of heist. It gets pulled off really well. I do think, the third act of this movie kind of falls off a little bit. I think the fact that they have to keep the audience in the dark about so much of it means that they can kind of end it however they want. And as long as they write a line about like, yep, remember when we talked about that 2 days ago? Like, they can just kind of introduce that, like, Deus ex machina thing and get themselves out of whatever corner they've written themselves into. I didn't like the addition of like the love interest / assassin that comes after Robert Redford. Like, it didn't seem necessary to me. So there's a couple things with the movie that I don't care for. But overall, I don't know if any movie in this vein has ever really topped this one. Like, I think this is probably a better movie than that Ocean's 11 remake, as much as I love it. And I think I'm going to give this movie a 9.5 out of 10, Brad.
Well, there you have it, folks. Bob and I are finishing up at a 9 out of 10 average. But we really want to know what you guys have to think. Have you seen The Sting before? Is it, one of your favorite heist con man style movies you've ever seen? Hit us up on the social medias. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at Film Whiskey.
Or you could leave us a voicemail. You can find us on anchor.fm/Film Whiskey, where you can leave us a message and we'll play your response on air. Once again, we want to say thank you to our friend Chris Blatner for joining us. Chris, do you have anything coming up that you'd like to give a quick plug for?
Nothing coming up, but just want to thank you guys for always a great time. Always love to hear your takes on movies, and thanks for having me back. And you can find me on Instagram at Urban Bourbonist.
All right, next week we will be back returning to the world of Al Pacino with 1975's also a heist classic, Dog Day Afternoon. I'm excited for that one, but until next time, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you then.